Afternoon all. Just want to give it another minute or two to see if we have any more people join us. I see we've still got some coming in through the lobby. So we'll just give it another minute before we get started. Okay, afternoon all. This is the Endpoint Management and Protection breakout session. So second one of the afternoon. I hope you all enjoyed your first session. Today's session, or this session, will be presented by myself, Bruce Knight. I'm a pre-sales solution consultant at Bytes, and I focus on all things Microsoft 365 related, so anything to do with Office 365, Windows, and enterprise mobility and security. So for today's session, we're going to dive into a little bit more detail around endpoint management capabilities and integration with things like the Microsoft 365 Defender suite of products, and how you can adopt a zero-touch or device-based zero-touch strategy. Verify everything, and then hopefully we can go through most of that. A couple of slides and then a demo. I also have Winston with me on the call. Winston.
Hello, yeah, I'm Winston Bond. I'm from Illumio. This is another partner of Bytes. I'm here to talk a little bit about another aspect of Zero Trust, which is Illumio's edge solution for endpoints.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'll try not to do too many slides. In our first session, we kind of ran out a bit of time, so we'll try and do more demo, as I think certainly in the morning session there were lots of comments around being able to actually see the capabilities in action. So I'll go through a couple of slides, and then before we get started though, I just wanted to bring up a few housekeeping points. You may have seen these in the first session, but if you didn't, it's just relating to the session will be recorded. So it's for other members that can make the session, or customers will be able to play this back and watch it in their own time. So this session is being recorded. Please, if I can ask you to stay muted during the session. If we have time for Q&A, we'll be able to unmute and ask questions. But during the session, if you have anything, please feel free to drop it in the chat. And we'll try and answer those throughout the course of the session. But let's get started. Just give me 1 second to get that up and running. Okay, so today we're going to focus on having a look at Microsoft Zero Trust architecture, and so specifically we're going to focus in on the devices piece. If you look all up at Microsoft Zero Trust, it kind of hinges around identities, devices, data, apps, infrastructure, and network. But as mentioned, this is an endpoint session, so we'll look at how you can create a Zero Trust device-based solution. So, what can you do? Hopefully you've already implemented things like MFA and looked at conditional access to protect identities. The next sort of weakest point in the chain is looking at devices. So you want to ensure that any device in your organization, whether it's a corporate issue device or unmanaged device, is healthy and compliant before you allow access into data and apps in either Microsoft 365 or other SaaS connected services and apps. And obviously in the middle of that is policy enforcement, so the engine that kind of you create those policies, leverage things like the Defender intelligence to be able to in real time remediate, look at alerts and incidents, and then report back device risks so that things like Intune and conditional access can kick off and block access into those services. But we'll get into a little bit more detail around that. I have included a slide if you haven't seen this architecture before. It's very high level, but it's a good sort of reference piece to just have a look at how the picture fits in there. We'll also be sharing these slides after the session, so you can have access to these at a later stage. But just to overlay the Microsoft solutions on top of that, so from an identity perspective, obviously Microsoft Azure AD, and that's where you create things like conditional access policies and MFA, Defender for Identity to look at some of those signals from an on-prem AD perspective and pick up lateral movements, escalation of privileges and those kinds of things. And so those can be detected with Defender for Identity. When we go to the device piece, Defender for Endpoints and Intune or Microsoft Endpoint Manager. And then as we move across into the right-hand side, we have Microsoft Information Protection capabilities and Cloud App Security, protecting data and into those apps and services in 365 and other connected SaaS apps, as well as on-prem through application proxy or app proxy capabilities. So that's where we all focus most of our time on from a device perspective. And then also there is an Azure Sentinel session, so you can learn a bit more about that, but there's connectors for most of the Microsoft solutions. So Defender for Endpoints, Defender for Identity, Azure AD, Cloud App Security all have connectors that can pull data into Azure Sentinel. So you can combine that with other Sentinel data and get the full picture through Microsoft Cloud SIEM capabilities. And just really quickly to reiterate, you may have seen these slides earlier. There's certainly been some changes to the branding of the different products, but besides those name changes, there's also been some changes to how Microsoft leveraged that cross-domain capability. So previously it was all siloed information. You had to jump into different admin portals to get the data and do some hunting across those different services. But fairly recently, as of earlier this year, they kind of now have implemented that new one portal to unify all those entities together into that single experience. So, in there you'll be able to see incidents and alerts that are correlated across the different domains, and much easier then to see, where the device may have been infected, but did it come in first from Defender for Office 365 and then hit the endpoint and then infected or got into identity. And so bring all those alerts together into a single platform or a portal that's much easier to start investigating and then ultimately remediates. So have a look at that through security.microsoft.com, and I'll jump into that in the demo in a little bit more detail. But as mentioned, the core objective here is to help you kind of think about how you can create that zero trust strategy from a device perspective. So making sure that you assume breach, trust nothing, verify everything, and so you want to take that approach from a device perspective as well. So what kind of things can you look at to achieve that? Obviously, the first piece, you want to have visibility into device health and compliance, and that's done through, enrolling devices into Microsoft Endpoint Manager, setting up compliance policies that those devices will be evaluated against, and then also then being able to leverage things like conditional access to prevent access into services in Office 365. For managed devices, but also for unmanaged devices, right, through things like looking at app protection policies for unenrolled devices that are unmanaged. And so when we dive into the device health piece, there's certainly a tie-in from a Defender for Endpoint perspective here. So Windows devices, you can have a look at the device risk status. So that will be pulled in by integrating Defender for Endpoint into Microsoft Endpoint Manager, but also now for Android and iOS devices as well. So there's little sliders that you can turn on in Microsoft Endpoint Manager tool or capability, that I'll show you that as part of the demo. Obviously, there's an integration piece you want to turn on in Defender for Endpoint, but then also on the Microsoft Endpoint Manager side of things as well. And so that will then give you the ability to, in your compliance policies, have a look at device risk, which will look at things like malicious apps, device manipulation, create those alerts, and once they're remediated, drop back down to a compliant device, and then once again allow access. And so that all works through, leveraging your compliance policies, through Endpoint Manager, looking at Azure AD and conditional access, and then you saying, only grant access if the device is compliant. And so if it's not, obviously you can block access until that device is remediated, and then once it's remediated, compliance status of that device will change, and then allow access into services. So there's kind of two approaches here. It's that fully managed device, where you enroll the device, Android, iOS, Mac, Windows devices, and then you kind of set up and configure that device, the security configurations, the applications can be deployed, and then you can manage how access to that device works through conditional access policies based on that device compliance state. Or you look at using application protection policies, or mobile application management for iOS and Android devices, and that's where you can create conditional launch policy that says if the device is at a risk status of medium, high, or low, or high or above that, then don't allow access into that specific application that's been protected through app protection policies. At the same time, you can also do things like prevent cut, copy, and paste from managed apps to personal apps, and so, the typical things you do through app protection policies. But a few scenarios that we'll have a look at. So if we look at, for example, a user that maybe opens up an attachment from their personal email or inserts a USB with some malicious payload on it, Defender for Endpoints will hopefully pick that up, send alerts through to Defender for Endpoint portal. Automatic remediation will kick in at that point, or if you haven't set that up, there might be some interaction needed from an SecOps person going in, having a look at that device, and then remediating any open alerts, which would then send back to Microsoft Endpoint Manager that it's now been remediated, and then change compliance status. And so we'll look at how you suspend access during that compromise through Intune and Azure AD, but certainly Defender for Endpoints will then share the telemetry back to the endpoints, as well as using Intelligent Security Graph to update other services in the Defender suite of products. So things like Defender for Office 365 can go in to check, any Office 365 infected mailboxes and pull out those attachments through Zap or 0-hour auto purge capabilities, and then block any future emails that may have that same attachment in them through that shared telemetry. And so then, once again, just diving into how do we suspend that access during a compromise, and that's once again using conditional access, the compliance status of that device, and then sharing that device risk status from Defender for Endpoints, and then into Intune, and then leveraging conditional access in Azure AD. And so while that device is infected, access will be restricted into your SaaS third-party apps that are connected through Azure AD, Office 365 apps, and other MCAS monitored apps as well. And so hopefully once Defender for Endpoint cleans up those endpoints, and then the device risk changes back down to an acceptable level, user will then have access back again into those services, because device compliance will change again to compliant, and then allow access into those services. The other scenario you can have a look at is looking at from a managed versus an unmanaged computer perspective, and using conditional access in Azure AD to bring in unmanaged devices through that MCAS session proxy capability. So when a user logs into an MCAS connected app, SharePoint, OneDrive, or other SaaS apps that you've connected in there, you can then create session policies that block users from being able to download files with sensitive information, or block all file downloads, block files from being uploaded, block cut, copy, and paste activities. And so lots you can do from session policy perspective, but also get much more visibility into what's happening in those connected apps from an unmanaged perspective. And then obviously, if that same user connects on their corporate device and it's healthy and compliant, then it will go down this route, and users will have full access. It won't go through the MCAS proxy. And just how that all kind of ties in, it's more for reference. You can have this as a takeaway to show you where, from a Defender or Microsoft 365 Defender perspective, where they kind of all tie in along this the attack kill chain perspective, and then all connecting up into Azure Sentinel at the top. So if we jump in then to our demo, let's have a look at how we set up a zero trust device-based solution. So the first thing we want to have a look at is jumping into that new unified portal, so security.microsoft.com, and very quickly you'll see that down the left hand side you'll have your incidents and alerts, endpoints section, so everything relating to Defender for endpoints kind of lives in this piece here. And then anything from an email Defender for Office 365 perspective falls into that piece, and then reports and some other capabilities down at the bottom here. But before you can get sort of anything up and running, and before you see alerts and incidents sort of correlating in here, you'd want to make sure that you are onboarding devices into the service. And so we'll start off at looking at how you do that. So if you go to settings in security.microsoft.com and we look at endpoints, and we look at onboarding, so you're not going to see anything until your device has been onboarded into the service. So there's lots of different ways to get device onboarded. The first piece here to look at the different operating systems, so Windows 10, Windows Server, Mac OS, Linux, iOS, and Android all supported. But certainly the easiest way, in my opinion, is to onboard these devices using Intune or Microsoft Endpoint Manager. You can do it through GPO, Config Manager, and other methods, but relatively easily to onboard devices using Intune, and I'll show you how that kind of plays out from a Microsoft Endpoint Manager or Intune perspective when I jump into that portal. But the first piece you need to do is make sure you've turned on the integration with Microsoft Intune under advanced features. So if we look at advanced features in here, there's probably a couple other things while you're in here that you want to also turn on, things like the integration into the other Defender suite of products. So Defender for Identity, Defender for Office 365 integration, turn those on, and then also turn on things like web content filtering. But the main piece here we want to look at is turn on the Microsoft Intune connection piece. And so this will also then enable things like if you've you go into certain vulnerability management and you create a new recommendation, which I'll show you in a little bit time, that will then open a ticket in Microsoft Endpoint Manager. So report that device risk status across into Intune, but also a bit more tie-in from a threat and vulnerability management perspective. And so once devices are onboarded and you set up that connection piece, then obviously you'll start to see incidents pop up in here. And so incidents is the place you would kind of start out at, so this will correlate alerts across the different sources as mentioned. So if you have the other services up and running like Microsoft Cloud App Security, Defender for Office 365 and Defender for Identity, these incidents will take alerts from all of those different sources and then create an incident that might have alerts originating from either one of those separate sources, but then pull it all together into a single incident, right? So you'll get the full picture when you look at those incidents rather than having to go out and search separately in those different siloed environments. But once you've, an incident created and these get created automatically, you can jump into that specific incident and start to investigate what happened. So here you can get some like high-level overview information, so the summary and what MITRE attack techniques have been used in that specific incident. Some more information specifically around those alerts that are that made up this incident, and then you can jump into these alerts to have more detailed information. You can pivot on the device and look at which devices were impacted on this alert or investigation or incidents, which users and you can also jump into that specific user, and you'll see here that this ties in nicely now with that same experience from a cloud app security perspective, where you get that investigation priority score. You can see alerts from other identity-based alerts, like activity from Tor, IP addresses, login from risky IPs, mass downloads from OneDrive and SharePoint, and all those other good things that MCAS brings to the table, as well as Defender for Identity and Identity Protection, all through this nice new kind of user-based investigation portal, without having to jump into anything else separately. So nice to go in and have a look at more detail there from a user perspective, but then also see what mailboxes were infected, and then jump into the specific investigation that got created as part of this. And so as part of that investigation, that'll kick off processes to collect information, and then you can then get some more information around, where this sort of originated, which devices were infected, a nice visual representation of that, and then see whether or not that was partially investigated or resolved or remediated. And if you had, maybe you don't have automation completely turned on now, if there was a piece that needs to be approved by a human being here, they could come in here and then approve that action to potentially stop a process or quarantine a file, for example. So an incident is a great place to go in. That just takes all your alerts rather than going in and looking at separate alerts to start at incidents. And then if we move down, hunting, is a great place when you sort of get more comfortable with Defender for Endpoints. You start to look at creating your own queries to search for specific entities or things that you want to find through this tool, and that also works cross domains, so not just from a device perspective, but also look at identities and email as well as part of that. There's lots of like ones that have been shared through the community, and you can jump in here and have a look at specific ones that somebody else may have created and run those in your organization. So maybe there's something you're looking just from a discovery perspective, you want to find a specific URL that an endpoint has been to, for example, and you can run that query, change the URL address there. Action Center is just where you can go in to have a look at the history or any pending actions that are required from you. But if there was something that was automatically remediated through a remediation that happened here automatically, a quarantine happened on a file, and I can jump in there and have a look at which file it was, get more detail around it, and then also if I need to undo that quarantine, for example. Threat analytics. So this is a great place to go and have a look at what are those sort of active threats that are out there, and potentially if any of your current devices are impacted. So you'll see if you've got any devices that are impacted in those threats. So if we have a look at like dark side ransomware, for example, these are constantly kept up to date. So you'll see, there's an overview, but there's also the analyst report, and there's a sort of log detail down the bottom here, so you can see when anything was changed or added to these, and so it's constantly kept up to date when new information is found and added. But the nice thing about looking at these is that you can have a look at mitigations, right? So if you're concerned that your organization might get hit with this, you can have a look at where you have specific vulnerabilities, and then go in and start to look at addressing those vulnerabilities in your organization so that you can mitigate against that threat in your organization. The next piece we'll have a look at here is device inventory. So this is the key piece that we're going to start to look at when we create and build out our conditional access policies and that integration with Defender for Endpoints or Intune. So obviously if there's malware on device or there's some suspicious behavior happening, it will then change that risk level based on those alerts that it starts to report into Defender for Endpoints, and that will then connect back to Intune and change the device risk status of that device, and the compliance status will then change to not compliant. But you can jump in here and get more details around any specific device in your organization, have a look at the overview, all the alerts associated to that device, have a look at it from a timeline perspective, any security recommendations for that device. So yeah, I can see that there's an old version of Notepad++, and I can do something to mitigate that, but we'll jump into that in TVM in a bit of time. Software inventory, have a look at everything that's running on this specific device, any discovered vulnerabilities or missing KVs. But what else you can do here is isolate that device. So if there's specific malware or infection on that device and you want to isolate it from the rest of the network, you can do that. But you can also allow things like Outlook and Teams to carry on running on that device while you remediate. And then once you're happy that it's all clean and good, you can allow it back to full use again. You can also do things like run antivirus scans, live response sessions, and all kinds of other good things on device level. That's not supported across all devices, but certainly from Windows perspective, Android and iOS, you don't have as much functionality from a device perspective. But if we drop down to vulnerability management, this is really great. So once you've onboarded devices and it starts to pull in that software inventory and looks at the security configurations on your device, it will then start to show up recommendations, and this is where it will affect your exposure score. So if there's known CVEs against the current apps and the way you've configured your device, obviously the score changes here. And so, for example, I have this outdated version of Notepad++. If I remediate that, it'll change my score, and then this will drop down to the exposure score won't be as high. And then that so there's lots of recommendations that will show up in your environment based on the apps that are installed, the way you've configured your device, and how up to date Windows OS is. But you can jump into these and then request remediation. So this is where that tie-in happens, but it also show you the associated CVEs, the installed devices, and other detail around that. But I can jump in here and request remediation, and here is where I can open a ticket to Microsoft Endpoint Manager, which will then show up in Intune, and then whoever looks after Intune can then accept that and then updates Notepad++ to the newest version, push that out to devices using Microsoft Endpoint Manager. But once you've created a recommendation or remediation from a recommendation, you'll be able to track that under the remediation tab. So in here you'll see that there's a couple that I got started on. So a couple of recommendations that I've completed, and then a few that are in progress. And so as I update these, this will then update, and I can then track it across to completion. So lots of good things you can look at in here. I can't go through everything in too much detail. So if you want to look at a bit more in depth, then certainly reach out to your account managers and we can do a bit more in depth demo on this. But the other nice piece to have a look at is this configuration management piece and the endpoints, and that will just show you devices that are on board. It's a nice high level information, but also compliance to the Defender for Endpoint baseline. So I'll talk a bit more about baselines when I get into Microsoft Endpoint Manager, but it's a great tool that you can leverage to set up your devices to match sort of Microsoft best practice, right? So instead of you having to go out and create all these configuration policies and apply them to devices, you can use the baseline settings, and that'll have multiple configurations, security recommendations that get applied to a device through one security baseline. So it's just a nice, quick, easy way for you to get a device to meet these sort of minimum recommendations. You don't have to use them, but it certainly helps. And you can also turn off some specific ones if you don't want to use them all. And then also if you use the web protection piece, nice sort of high-level stuff on content filtering through Defender for Endpoint. So that's a quick overview on Defender for Endpoint, but certainly we want to now look at how we can leverage this information from Defender for Endpoint in Microsoft Endpoint Manager or Intune, and start to then build out the Zero Trust capability. So make sure that only compliant devices access data in your organization, and that's done through once the device is enrolled into the service. If you want to know more about Microsoft Endpoint Manager, we did run a webinar a couple of weeks back, around how to enroll devices, and we have workshops, and we can go into more detail around that. Unfortunately, on today's call, we don't have the time for that. So we're going to focus more in on how do you set up some of those endpoint security capabilities to work with Defender for Endpoint. So the first piece, obviously, is as mentioned, Microsoft Endpoint Manager is a great tool to onboard devices into Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. And so we can jump into the setup piece and the endpoint security in Intune. and then just have a look at the MDM compliance settings. So this is where you turn it on for Android, for iOS, and for Windows devices. So flick the switch on over there. If you want to use them with those app protection policy settings that I mentioned earlier on as well, so for unmanaged devices, you can flick them on here. And then to set it up, you make sure that sensor is up and running on Windows devices. There's a single configuration profile that you need to configure. So you can click the link here and it'll set up and create a config profile. You then assign it to the devices that you want to be onboarded. Once that's done, the next time that device checks in with Intune, it'll turn on the sensor, it'll onboard into the service, and you'll start to see that report into Defender for Endpoint. And so you'll have that connection back in that way, but you then want to make sure that you're getting that device risk score back in from Defender for Endpoint into Microsoft Endpoint Manager. And so that's where you look to device compliance. And so, typically you're going to create a device compliance policy, which, when a device gets enrolled, it'll evaluate that device against that compliance policy and make sure that it meets the minimum requirements that you've set out. And one of those will be device risk. So if we have a look at a Windows 10 compliance policy, and the same applies to iOS and Android devices. So, if we create a Windows one, you'll see that, there's lots of parameters that you might want to evaluate against to make sure your device is healthy and secure before you allow access. So certainly from a system security perspective, things like encryption, AV settings, anti-spyware, and that can be with third-party AV solutions as well, and then more specifically for Defender, and then even more specifically for Defender for Endpoint, we want to get that device risk status. And so we can say in here, well, before I allow a device access, it must be clear of any risk, or you could say it needs to be low or higher before it gets marked as not compliant. And so that's where you set that piece up, go through next, apply that to those devices, and then it will continuously evaluate your devices against that compliance profile. And if alert pops up on a device because of malicious activity, it will immediately check in with the Intune service, change the compliance status, and then if you have conditional access policies set up and configured, it will then block access to those services. And so that will get set up and configured through looking at that compliance status. So if we look at now devices after you've created a compliance policy, you can see that, for example, this device, which is an Android device, is not compliant, and the reason why it's not compliant is because of the device risk machine score is at the wrong level. You can validate that by going back into Defender for Endpoints, having a look at why, and so here I can see it's at medium, and then I can go in here and resolve any open alerts, make sure that devices are healthy. That'll then talk back to Intune and change that to compliance. While we're in here, so I mentioned security baselines. So this is where you can quickly turn on, all those recommended features. Certainly something that you probably want to test out before you go and do this widespread in your organization, but lots of good settings that are configured out the box. Once you've created a profile with a security baseline, you can then track that, make sure you see which devices it's been connected up against. So there's lots of good information here. I can see this was successfully rolled out to 2 and matched the default settings across the board here, which is good news. No errors, no conflicts, nothing pending still. So happy days on this one. But I can also check out the audit logs, security posture status to get a bit more information once I roll out these security baselines through this feature. So there's 2 that you have. There's the security baseline, which is typical things you want to set up. But there's also then, if you do use Defender for Endpoints, you might want to use the security baseline plus add on the Defender for Endpoint baseline as well. This sets up a lot more in terms of, if we look at this one, we're doing a lot more for things like attack surface reduction rules, more on BitLocker, device guard, and those things that work really well with Defender for Endpoint. So have a look at those settings. You can come in here and change these before applying them to devices. So certainly when you use these baselines, you know, if you don't want to use BitLocker, say not configured, maybe using a third-party encryption tool, so that's fine. You can change it to not configured before you apply it, and it won't set that. But they're great to leverage for making sure that, you know, if you're not too familiar with how to set up and configure your devices, start with those security baselines. Great tools to use. And so, you know, once you've set up and configured your device the way you want it, the next piece then is to look at how you can leverage conditional access to then block devices that are not compliant, right? So in here, you're going to go and create a device conditional access policy. So, for example, here I've got one that's applied to all users and groups, all cloud apps, and the condition I've set in here is just to include it for Android and iOS. I could include Windows in this as well. I've got a separate one for Windows because maybe you want to also leverage a couple of other ground controls for your Windows platform, things like hybrid Azure AD join, for example. But for this one, I want to look specifically at that compliance status of the device. So only grant access if the device is compliant, right? And so then, you know, user comes in with their Android device or iOS device, it'll check the status, the compliance status of that device before allowing it access into any of these cloud connected or cloud apps. So whether they're the 365 ones or other SaaS apps that you've connected into Azure AD. And so, you know, you can use that for the compliance status, but as well as when I spoke about using app protection policies to do a similar thing. So where if a device is not enrolled, for example, and you can't leverage that compliance status, you can leverage your existing app protection policies that get created under the apps piece in Intune. So if we look at Windows, well, let's not look at, if we look at Android, so app protection policies for Android and iOS, and then we go and let's take this Android one, for example. So app protection policy is a great way to set up and configure data protection on unmanaged devices. You can use app protection policies on managed devices as well, but work really well in that BYOD scenario where you can do things like configure those apps that you include. So, I mean, there's a list of apps that I've included here. There's far more you can add to this, but block uploads into iCloud, maybe block, cut, copy and paste from, you know, business managed apps out into personal apps, but you want to allow paste in, do things like set up PIN access requirements of PINs, biometrics, all those things you can configure and set up in here. But the piece I want to call out is this conditional launch. And so this is where you can leverage the device threat level. And so that's using Defender for Endpoint or other third-party Microsoft threat defense tools. And here you can then set up, you know, what the value needs to be, and then what happens if it's low or higher to block access or wipe data. And so then when a device that's unmanaged, you know, that user opens up Outlook that's app protected, it'll evaluate and check that device threat level before allowing access into that app as well. So not just looking at, you know, the other access requirements, but also looking at the device threat level at the same time. That's pretty much all we have time for, but hopefully, you know, that gives you enough to go on from a device perspective and how you can secure devices and look at that zero trust model. If you want to jump into a little bit more detail, as mentioned, you know, we can always schedule one-on-ones at a later date, but hopefully giving you enough to go on there. For now, obviously there's tie-ins to things like Microsoft Cloud App Security, which is great, another tool you can leverage to secure you know, browser-based access for unmanaged devices, block downloads, restrict, cut, copy and paste, connect apps in there, and a whole bunch of other capabilities that you can leverage from that perspective. But with that, I'll hand over to Winston to talk to you a little bit more about Illumio Edge capabilities and how that complements you know, things like Microsoft Defender for Endpoint.
Thanks, Bruce. Yeah, so I think I managed to share the screen. Yes, I did. Yeah, so I'm Winston. I'm going to talk a little bit, very briefly, run through Illumio, what the company, what the product does, how it works, and what it's for. Illumio is a mid-sized company that is focused on network segmentation, or specifically microsegmentation. What's microsegmentation? Well, we tend to talk, or we describe it by sort of an analogy with ships or submarines. So, if you take a ship or a submarine, it's broken up into compartments with big bulkheads between them, and if you get a hole, then you close the doors. One of the compartments fills up, which is very unfortunate if you happen to be there, but at least the whole thing doesn't sink. So what we're trying to do here is pretty much the same thing, but for computer networks, so that it's not really an if, it's a when something gets in. It doesn't get any further. We stop the lateral movement from the place where the attacker breaks in. So I think it's going to play this video again, isn't it? No. One day I'll learn to use PowerPoint. So the way the Illumio Edge operates is as part of zero trust, or as part of a zero trust approach. So we we enable the Windows firewall, and we tell it to block inbound traffic and allow outbound traffic, and only allow inbound traffic from places it should be allowed from, which doesn't sound like rocket science. The firewall's been there for forever. Why don't people just do that? Well, the issue is managing that at scale with different user groups, different people needing different things, lots of peer-to-peer applications around these days. You can't just turn off everything inbound anymore. So the solution is really all about managing those settings. And what does that do for you? Well, why would you do this? Let's take Bob as our example. He goes to the coffee shop or sits in his home office, logs in remotely, he gets authorized, so he's now on the network, and then he clicks something he shouldn't do. He's had a phishing attack. Something somehow gets installed on his device. Well, that's standard kind of antivirus stuff. We all know about endpoint protection. Bruce was talking about that. But what if this is a sort of the zero-day attack where it hasn't been seen before? So the antivirus isn't going to pick it up. It's going to get monitored, but it's not instantly going to get stopped by the by Windows endpoint protection, Windows Defender for endpoints. So then what happens is the malware, the ransomware tries to spread out around the network. And in this case, we've got Illumio Edge deployed. So what happens is it goes off trying to find open ports on the network, and it doesn't find any. It doesn't find ports that don't need to be open. So it doesn't get very far. And in a couple of hours' time, what's going to happen is the virus scanner, the EDR tool, is going to catch up and is going to start blocking things. But in that window, there's plenty of time. 2 hours is a lot of time, or even if it's an hour, half an hour, that's still, it takes seconds for something to go around a network, infect other things, encrypt data, and then you're stuffed, and you've got a very expensive problem on your hands. So that's why we do it. How the solution works, I kind of described it already. So we install not an agent. I like a term I heard Bruce using earlier, which was a sensor, into each endpoint device, so that controls the firewall. So we aren't in line. We're not installing our own firewall. What we're doing is just controlling it. So we send telemetry information about what's actually happening back to our central compute engine, which is a SaaS hosted program that you get a web UI to, and then so we can then see what's happening. You can program the policy compute engine, the central brain of the operation, to tell it what should be allowed. It will then do all the number crunching to work out which IP addresses should be allowed to talk to which other IP addresses, and send that down to all the endpoints. And if Bob picks up his laptop and walks from the coffee shop to his home office or into the physical office, it'll recalculate all the rules and update all the IP addresses, so that it's constantly updated. You know, trying to do this kind of thing in network hardware is pretty much impossible because people move around. IP addresses change. You can't really segment down to the level of a certain user in a certain department is allowed to do one thing, but somebody else is allowed to do something different. So that's the way the system operates. As I say, we're installing a very lightweight agent into each endpoint, which has no user controls, nothing for the end user to do. It just sits there. So it's a way of deploying the zero trust model on the network with minimal impact. You can have zero trust and just break everything. That's not going to be very popular in most companies. So we can do zero trust with zero touch. So we're not modifying your network. There's nothing for, as I say, nothing for the end users to control. It's very lightweight, doesn't cost performance. Nobody's going to notice it. The policy model is very simple. The admin in the center decides what should be allowed in for which groups of users, and it gets deployed. And how your network's built really doesn't matter. So it just keeps working. And the compute engine, that the brains of the operation is all cloud-based. So there's no central servers or anything like that to stand up. You just connect to it and it works. So I don't really have time today to do demos or anything much more sophisticated than this very quick introduction. But if you're interested in a little bit more information or getting into the details some more, then get in touch with Bytes and we'd be happy to set something up. So I'll hand it back to Bruce now, unless there's any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Winston. I think we have a couple of minutes if there's any questions. Feel free to put up your hand or unmute and ask a question. Try our best to answer. So let's give a couple of minutes. While we're waiting, there's also a feedback survey you might have noticed in the chat window. So please, will you leave your feedback? There's a link posted by Michael Holden. If you can just click on that and fill that out when you get a chance, that'll be great. Thank you. Cool. I know we, as mentioned, if there is any further information you require, or if you'd like to have a follow-up session one-to-one, please do reach out for either, to your Bytes account manager, for either Lumio or myself, to jump on another call to go into a bit more detail. But otherwise, thank you for your time today. I hope the session was valuable.